I burst out laughing at my wife's funeral. I was in the hospital room at 3 a.m. when I felt my wife's hand go cold in mine. 38 years. That's all we got. 38 years wasn't nearly enough. The doctor had insisted I wait outside during her final procedure, something about hospital protocol that didn't make sense, but I was too exhausted to argue. I sat in the waiting room for another hour, even after the nurses gently suggested I should go home. How do you let go of 38 years? The next 3 days blurred together. I couldn't eat. Everything tasted like cardboard. Sleep was impossible because every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The house felt wrong without her in it. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter, half drunk with her lipstick stain on the rim. I couldn't bring myself to wash it. When I asked about seeing her body to say goodbye, the funeral director said she was already prepared, and it would be too distressing, closed casket only, no exceptions. Everything triggered memories. I'd found myself standing in the bathroom yesterday, staring at the spot where we'd slow danced 20 years ago. We'd just moved in together and spent 3 hours fighting about whether to get striped or polka dot shower curtains. We ended up with a clear one neither of us wanted. That night, exhausted from arguing, she'd pulled me into the bathroom and we'd danced to no music at all, her head on my chest, humming off-key. "We're idiots," she'd whispered. "Perfect idiots," I'd agreed. Her phone was missing from her personal effects. The hospital said it must have been misplaced during the confusion, which seemed odd since she never let that thing out of her sight. My sister handled most of the funeral arrangements because I couldn't function. She kept exchanging these weird looks with the funeral director, like they knew something I didn't. Every decision felt impossible. What flowers? What music? What did any of it matter when Isabel wasn't here to laugh about how formal and stuffy it all was? Friday came too fast. I stood at the funeral home entrance, watching people file in wearing black, looking appropriately melancholy. Isabel would have hated this. She would have made jokes about how everyone looked like they were attending a tax audit, not celebrating someone's life. Her best friend Lisa wasn't there. Apparently she'd, suddenly, had to leave town for a family emergency the day after Isabel died. The funeral director guided me to the podium. I had note cards with a perfectly appropriate eulogy my sister helped me write. Isabel Elizabeth Delaney was a devoted wife. I started reading, my voice shaking. The words felt like lies, not because they weren't true, but because they weren't her. I looked up at the crowd. Her mom was crying silently. Her dad sat stone-faced. Her quirky cousins, who usually couldn't stop talking, sat in stiff suits, silent. Everyone looked miserable, formal, wrong. This wasn't Isabel. This wasn't us. I continued reading. She touched many lives with grace during her depressing battle with... My voice caught. Depressing battle? Isabel wore rainbow wigs to chemo and did a victory dance every time she finished a treatment. I was about to continue when something in my brain just clicked one night 5 years ago after her co-worker's funeral. We'd gotten drunk on wine and made the most ridiculous pact. Whoever died first, the other had to rickroll everyone at their funeral. "Promise me," she'd said, laughing so hard she cried. "Actually rickroll them, play the whole song." We even pinky swore on it like kids. One click on my phone, and suddenly the opening drums of "Never Gonna Give You Up" filled the funeral home. The silence was deafening for about 3 seconds. Then I started singing, badly, just like she would have wanted. "Never gonna give you up! Never gonna let you down!" Someone gasped. Her college roommate started giggle-crying. Within 30 seconds, the entire funeral home was singing Rick Astley at the top of their lungs, crying and laughing simultaneously. "Ne'er gonna ruin around and desert you!" The funeral director kept checking his phone and glancing at the casket, like he was waiting for something. When the song ended, everyone was applauding, actually applauding at a funeral. I froze, because I saw her lips curve slightly in the casket. Just the tiniest movement, like she was trying not to laugh. My heart stopped. I stepped closer, my legs barely working. Her chest, was it moving? The funeral director grabbed my arm. "Mr. Delaney, we need to..." Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I yanked my arm free and lunged toward the casket. Matthias moved faster than I expected, his hand clamping down on my shoulder with surprising strength. 2 other funeral home employees appeared from the side door, both in dark suits, forming a wall between me and Isabel. The crowd started murmuring, confused voices rising behind me. I tried to push past Matthias, but he held firm, his fingers digging into my shoulder. I could see the casket over his shoulder, just 10 feet away, but these 3 men weren't budging. My voice came out louder than I meant it to. She moved. I saw her lips move. Her chest was rising. Someone needed to check if she was breathing. Matthias spoke in this low, calm voice about grief and stress and how the mind plays tricks when we lose someone. He used words like hallucination and emotional exhaustion. I kept trying to get around him, but the other 2 employees moved with him, blocking every angle. My sister appeared at my side, her face completely white. She put her hand on my arm and started pulling me backward, away from the casket. The funeral attendees were standing now, half of them looking at me like I'd lost my mind, the other half glancing at each other trying to figure out if they should leave. Isabel's mom was sobbing harder than before, these awful choking sounds. Her dad had both arms around her, his face stone cold, staring at me. The college roommate who'd been giggle-crying during the song looked actually scared now, her hand over her mouth. My sister kept pulling at my arm, whispering that we should go somewhere quiet and talk. Matthias suggested his office, his voice still too calm, too practiced, like he'd done this before. My sister agreed immediately without even looking at me. That made my stomach drop. She wasn't questioning what I saw. She wasn't asking if I was sure. She just wanted me away from the casket. The 2 employees stayed between me and Isabel while Matthias guided us toward a side hallway. I looked back at the casket one more time, but I couldn't see her face from this angle. The crowd was breaking apart, some people heading for the exit, others clustering together talking in hushed voices. Matthias's office smelled like furniture polish and old paper. He offered me water from a small fridge in the corner. I didn't take it. My hands were shaking, so hard I had to shove them in my pockets. He sat behind his desk and started talking about the stages of grief, how denial manifests differently in everyone, how the stress of losing a spouse after 38 years can cause the mind to see things that aren't there. I cut him off mid-sentence. I wanted to see Isabel's body up close. I wanted to check for breathing myself. Right now. Matthias shook his head slowly, his expression practiced sympathy. He mentioned health regulations, the preparation process, how viewing would be inadvisable at this point. My sister sat down beside me in one of the leather chairs, her hand finding mine and squeezing too tight. I pulled away and looked at her directly. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I asked her straight out what she'd been hiding, why she and Matthias had been exchanging those looks all week. She finally looked at me and said I wasn't thinking clearly, that grief was making me paranoid. But her voice shook when she said it. Matthias kept talking about trauma responses and how common it was for grieving spouses to experience visual distortions. The way he said it sounded rehearsed, like he'd given this speech before. I stood up fast enough that my chair scraped backward. I told them I was leaving. My sister called after me to wait, but I was already at the door. I sat in my car in the funeral home parking lot for 20 minutes. The engine was off. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I kept replaying that moment over and over. The way her lips curved, just slightly. The movement was so small, but I saw it. I know I saw it. The longer I sat there, the more convinced I became that I wasn't imagining things. Isabel's chest had moved. It was subtle, but it was there. My sister knocked on the car window, but I didn't look at her. She stood there for a minute, then walked back inside. Other cars started leaving, funeral attendees heading home, probably talking about the crazy widower who had a breakdown. I didn't care what they thought. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong since the hospital. At home, I went straight to the dining room table where I'd been keeping all the hospital paperwork. I spread everything out, looking for anything that didn't make sense. The missing phone kept bothering me. Isabel documented everything during her treatment. Photos of her rainbow wigs, videos of her victory dances after chemo, voice memos about how she was feeling. She never went anywhere without that phone. The hospital said it was misplaced during the confusion, but that didn't track. I started going through the consent forms, the treatment records, the discharge papers. Everything looked normal until I found the final procedure consent form. Dr. Crawford's signature was at the bottom, but I didn't remember signing anything. I checked the timestamp. 2:47 a.m. I was in the waiting room at 2:47. The nurse had told me to wait outside at 2:30. No doctor came to get me for signatures. I would remember that. I read through the form 3 times. It authorized some kind of final procedure, but the medical terminology was dense, and I couldn't make sense of most of it. What I did understand was that someone had signed this form, and it wasn't me. I called the hospital and asked for Dr. Crawford. The receptionist put me on hold. Elevator music played for 15 minutes straight. When she came back on the line, her voice had changed. She said Dr. Crawford wasn't available and would call me back. I asked when. She said she couldn't say. I asked if I could leave a message. She said she'd pass along that I called. Something in her tone sounded off, like she was reading from a script someone had written for her. I hung up and stared at the consent form on the table. The signature looked nothing like mine. The handwriting was too neat, too careful. I grabbed my phone and took photos of every page of the document. Then I called my sister. She didn't pick up. I called again. Still no answer. I left a message asking her to call me back, that I needed to talk about the hospital paperwork. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I looked at Isabel's coffee mug still sitting on the counter, the lipstick stain on the rim. 3 days ago, I thought I'd never see her again. Now I didn't know what to think. I grabbed my phone and pulled up Lisa's contact. The call went straight to voicemail without even ringing once, like her phone was off or she'd blocked me. I stared at the screen for a minute before trying her work number. The receptionist answered on the second ring, and I asked for Lisa. There was a pause. Then she told me Lisa had taken an extended leave of absence. I asked when it started, and she said the day after Isabel died. The way she said it sounded rehearsed, like she'd been told what to say if anyone called asking about Lisa. My sister showed up at my house around 6 that evening carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She set it on the counter next to Isabel's coffee mug and told me I needed to eat something. I didn't touch it. We sat at the kitchen table and she kept looking at her hands instead of at me. Finally, she said the funeral director had warned her I might have a breakdown. She said seeing dead people move or breathe in their caskets was common with grief, that the mind plays tricks when you're in shock. Her voice was too gentle, like she was talking to a child. I asked her straight out why she didn't tell me about Lisa leaving town. She looked up at me and hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. She said Lisa couldn't handle losing Isabel, that they'd been best friends since college, and Lisa just fell apart. But her voice wavered when she said it, unsteady and thin, like she was reading lines someone else had written for her. I watched her face and knew she was lying, but I didn't call her on it yet. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until 2 a.m. Sleep wasn't happening. I got up, got dressed, and drove back to the funeral home. The building was dark when I pulled into the parking lot, except for one light glowing in what looked like the basement level. Matthias's car was still there, along with 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. I parked across the street where I could see the entrance and the side door. I sat there watching for an hour. My hands gripped the steering wheel, and I counted the minutes on the dashboard clock. At 3:15, a woman in scrubs came out the side door. She looked around the parking lot before walking to one of the unfamiliar cars and driving away. Funeral homes don't have medical staff working in the middle of the night. They don't have anyone in scrubs at all. The next morning, I called Isabel's mom. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding tired. I asked if she noticed anything strange at the hospital or the funeral. There was a long silence before she said everything seemed normal. Then she added that it all happened so fast, how they rushed the funeral arrangements, how she barely had time to process that Isabel was gone before they were planning the service. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I felt bad for making her relive it, but I needed to know if I was the only one who thought something was wrong. I hung up and grabbed a notebook from the junk drawer. I started writing down everything that didn't make sense. The closed casket requirement with no explanation. Isabel's missing phone that she never went anywhere without. Lisa suddenly leaving town the day after Isabel died. My sister exchanging looks with the funeral director like they shared a secret. The consent form with the forged signature at 2:47 in the morning. Medical staff at the funeral home at 3 in the morning. Matthias checking his phone and watching the casket during the rickroll. The list filled an entire page. I drove back to the hospital and walked straight to the main desk. I told them I needed to see records from my wife's final hours. The receptionist made a phone call, and 10 minutes later, a woman came down to meet me. She introduced herself as Violet Fitzpatrick, the hospital administrator. She led me to her office on the 3rd floor, which seemed odd for a simple records request. Most people just dealt with the records department in the basement. Violet sat behind her desk and folded her hands on top of a manila folder. She explained that due to privacy protocols and the sensitive nature of end-of-life care, certain records required special clearance to release. She was professional and calm, but her eyes kept darting to her computer screen like she was reading something there. Every time I asked a question, her gaze would flick to the monitor before she answered, like someone was feeding her responses in real time. I noticed her nameplate on the desk, Violet Fitzpatrick, same last name as Matthias. I asked her if they were related. She stiffened just slightly, her shoulders going rigid for half a second before she relaxed them again. She admitted he was her brother, then quickly added that Fitzpatrick was a common name, and it didn't mean anything. But the way she said it felt defensive, like she'd been caught at something. I pushed forward in my chair. Why did Crawford make me leave the room during that final procedure? Violet's expression smoothed out, and she folded her hands on the desk. She explained that some patients prefer privacy during their final moments. Perhaps Isabel had requested it. That made no sense. Isabel and I went through every single treatment together, every procedure, every scan, every appointment. She held my hand through the worst of it, and I held hers. She never wanted privacy from me. Not once in 38 years. I stood up and told Violet I wanted copies of everything. She said it would take time to process the request. I left without saying anything else. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and searched for Matthias Fitzpatrick. His funeral home website came up first. Professional photos, calming music, standard stuff. I added Violet's name to the search. The results changed. Medical journals, research papers, articles about end-of-life care. I clicked on the first one. They were siblings. Both of them worked in end-of-life care. Matthias ran the funeral home. Violet handled hospital administration. They had written papers together, co-authored studies. I scrolled through the titles: Innovative Hospice Protocols, Family-Centered Care Models, Grief Management Strategies. My stomach turned. I clicked on an article from 2 years ago. The title talked about experimental treatments for terminal patients who had run out of options. I skimmed the abstract. Clinical trials, careful family management, avoiding false hope. The words blurred together. I had to read it 3 times before it sank in. They were talking about lying to families, managing expectations by controlling information. My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I set it on the dashboard and gripped the steering wheel. The article went on about ethical considerations, patient autonomy, informed consent. But buried in the middle was a section about simulation protocols, creating controlled environments, limiting family contact during critical phases. I grabbed my phone and called my sister. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I found. The articles, the research, Matthias and Violet working together. I asked if anyone had mentioned experimental treatments to her. There was a long silence on the other end. Just breathing. Then she said we should talk in person, that she would come over right away. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I paced around my living room for 40 minutes. When the doorbell rang, I practically ran to open it. My sister stood there, but she wasn't alone. Nurse Jacqueline stood next to her, the same nurse who had suggested I go home from the hospital that night, the same one who kept checking on me in the waiting room. My sister walked past me into the house. Jacqueline followed. They both sat on the couch. I stayed standing. Jacqueline looked at me and said there was something I needed to understand about Isabel's final treatment options. She started talking. Isabel had been offered entry into an experimental trial 3 weeks before she died. A last-chance treatment with serious risks. The trial required something unusual, a simulated death, a funeral. The whole thing staged. She said it was to protect the research from interference, to manage family expectations during the uncertain outcome period. The words came out of her mouth, but they didn't make sense. I heard them but couldn't process them. I was standing now. Actually, I realized I had been standing the whole time, but now I was shouting. Nobody has the right to fake someone's death. This is insane. This is illegal. This is wrong. My sister started crying. She said Isabel made her promise not to tell me. That Isabel knew I would refuse to let her take the risk. That Isabel wanted this chance, even if it meant putting me through hell. I looked at my sister and asked how she could keep this from me, how she could watch me grieve, how she could help plan a funeral for someone who might not be dead. Jacqueline reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She opened it on the coffee table. Documents, forms, consent papers. She pointed to signatures. Isabel's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The way she made her capital I, the loop in her Y. Jacqueline explained the protocol. Staged death, closed casket funeral, 6-week isolation period during treatment. There was a clause highlighted in yellow. It said the spouse would only be told if the patient didn't survive the actual treatment. I read it 5 times. My brain couldn't accept what my eyes were seeing. I demanded to know if Isabel was alive right now. Jacqueline said she couldn't confirm patient status, but the trial facility was 2 hours away. She gave me that information carefully, like she was walking a line between rules and mercy. I turned to my sister. She was still crying, but she met my eyes. She admitted she had known for 5 days that Isabel survived the initial treatment phase. 5 days. She knew for 5 days and said nothing while I fell apart. The rage hit me first. Hot and sharp and overwhelming. They lied to me. All of them. Isabel, my sister, the doctors, the nurses, the funeral director. They put me through a funeral. Let me think my wife was dead. Let me grieve. Let me break. But under the rage was something else. Hope. Desperate, terrified hope that maybe Isabel was actually alive. That maybe I hadn't lost her. That maybe we still had time. I grabbed my keys from the table, headed for the door. Jacqueline stood up and blocked my way. She said I couldn't just show up at a medical research facility making demands, that there were protocols, procedures, rules. I told her I didn't care about rules. She had just told me my wife might be alive and expected me to sit here and do nothing. Jacqueline held up both hands and started talking fast about treatment protocols and critical phases. She said any disruption right now could mess up Isabel's recovery completely. The words came out in this practiced way like she'd rehearsed them. She explained that Isabel specifically didn't want me to know because she knew exactly what I'd do. I'd try to stop her from taking the risk. I'd argue and fight and refuse to let her gamble with the 1% chance. My sister moved closer and pulled something from her purse. An envelope. White paper with my name written on it in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. The way Isabel made her capital letters, the slight slant to the right, the loop in her lowercase g. My hands shook when I took it. The date in the corner said 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before she supposedly died. I opened it standing right there in my living room while Jacqueline and my sister watched me. The letter started with her telling me she couldn't watch me watch her die slowly anymore. She wrote about the treatment being a 1% chance, but how she had to take it. She said if I was reading this letter, it meant she survived the first phase. She said she loved me. The paper crinkled in my grip. I read it again. Then again. 5 times total before the words actually made sense in my brain. Her voice came through in every sentence. I recognized the way she wrote, the phrases she'd use when talking to me. She explained that the funeral would be the hardest part, that she almost told me a dozen times but couldn't. She needed me to grieve authentically, so no one would suspect the trial protocol was being broken. She wrote that she knew I'd hate her for this, but she was choosing the chance to live over letting me say goodbye properly. I looked up at Jacqueline with tears blurring my vision. I asked about the Rick roll, about why she moved during the song. Jacqueline's professional face cracked a little. She admitted that wasn't supposed to happen. Isabel was under deep sedation, completely out, but apparently our pact was strong enough to break through the drugs. The funeral director got an alert on his phone that her vitals had spiked. He panicked because the whole thing almost got exposed right there in front of everyone. I was crying now, actually crying, which I hadn't let myself do since that first night in the hospital. Processing that Isabel was alive felt impossible. But also processing that she orchestrated all of this, that she let me suffer through thinking she was dead, that she made me stand at that podium and give a eulogy. Jacqueline said Isabel was asking to see me now that I knew the truth. But I needed to understand the treatment wasn't finished. The outcome was still uncertain. She could still die for real this time. My sister grabbed her keys from the table. She said she'd drive me to the research facility. It was 2 hours north of here. She talked the whole drive up the highway, told me how Isabel made her swear to protect the trial, how she'd been visiting Isabel every other day while I thought my wife was dead, how guilty she felt watching me fall apart, how many times she almost broke and told me everything. She cried while driving, and I just stared out the window trying to process any of this. The facility looked nothing like a hospital, more like a private medical clinic tucked away in the woods. Unmarked building, no signs, just trees everywhere. Violet Fitzpatrick met us at the entrance. Same last name as the funeral director. She led me through security protocols that felt more intense than airport screening. She explained that Isabel's immune system was compromised from the treatment. I'd need to follow strict contamination procedures. They gave me scrubs to change into in a small room. Then I went through a disinfection process that took 20 minutes, standing in different chambers while machines sprayed stuff on me. Violet walked beside me through hallways, explaining that the treatment involved aggressive cellular regeneration. It left Isabel vulnerable to infection. She was in a sterile environment. Our visit would be through a glass partition with an intercom system. No touching, no physical contact, just talking through phones like a prison visit. When we got to her room, I saw her through the glass, and my legs almost gave out. She looked thin and pale, so much thinner than at the funeral. But she was sitting up, moving, breathing, actually alive and real and looking at me with tears running down her face. She picked up the intercom phone on her side. Her voice came through the speaker saying she was sorry, that she knew I was angry, but she had to try. I pressed my hand against the glass. She matched it from her side, palm to palm with only the barrier between us. I cried too hard to speak for several minutes, just stood there with my hand on the glass and tears pouring down my face while she cried on the other side. Finally, I asked her how she could put me through a funeral, how she could let me think she was dead. She said it was the only way to make the trial possible, that she couldn't die slowly while I watched helplessly, that she'd rather I hate her and she'd have a chance to live than have me hold her hand while cancer killed her piece by piece. Her voice broke when she said it. I could see her shaking on the other side of the glass. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve and tried to pull myself together. Isabel picked up the intercom phone again, and her voice came through shaky but clear. She told me the scans from yesterday showed the treatment was actually working. The cancer was responding better than anyone expected, but she needed 4 more weeks in this room before they'd know if it was permanent or just temporary. Her face looked scared when she said it, like she was asking permission for something she already did. She admitted she didn't know if this was the right choice, putting me through the funeral and everything. I pressed both hands against the glass and told her I understood why she did it. Then I started telling her about the funeral, about how I played the song like we promised. Her whole face changed when I described everyone singing Rick Astley at the top of their lungs. She started laughing, that same laugh that used to fill our kitchen on Saturday mornings, and I realized I thought I'd never hear it again. She said she heard the music through the sedation, that she was supposed to stay completely under, but the song pulled her back. Our promise was stronger than whatever drugs they gave her. We talked through the glass for 2 hours straight. She described the treatment process, how they basically reset her immune system, and it hurt worse than anything she'd been through before. She said the uncertainty was the hardest part, not knowing if this would actually work or if she was putting everyone through hell for nothing. She'd been asking about me every single day since the procedure started. My sister had shown her photos from the funeral on her phone. Pictures of me at the podium and seeing me up there almost made her break the whole protocol and tell everyone she was alive. Violet came in around noon and said visiting time was done. Isabel needed to rest because the treatment took everything out of her. Isabel and I made plans for me to come back in 3 days, and she promised that if the treatment failed, she'd tell me herself this time. No more fake deaths or secrets. I didn't want to leave, but Violet was already opening the door. My sister drove us back home and apologized the entire way down the highway. She kept saying she was sorry for lying, sorry for watching me suffer, sorry for being part of the whole thing. I was too tired to be angry anymore, just relieved and scared and hopeful all mixed together, trying to process that I might actually get more time with Isabel. The house felt different when we got back, like the walls had shifted slightly. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour just staring at nothing. The next morning, I started making phone calls. I had to explain to people that there was a mistake, that Isabel was actually in treatment, and the funeral happened too early. I used a cover story about her being in a coma that I misunderstood as death. It sounded completely insane, but people accepted it because what else could they do? Isabel's parents were the hardest call. Her mom answered, and when I told her, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. Then her dad got on the phone, and he was happy and furious at the same time. He demanded to know why nobody told them about the trial, why they had to sit through a funeral for their daughter who was actually alive. I explained that Isabel wanted to protect everyone from false hope, that she didn't want people watching and waiting and getting their hearts broken if it didn't work. He hung up on me, but called back 10 minutes later to ask when he could visit. I went back to see Isabel every 3 days like the protocol allowed. Each visit, she looked a little stronger. Her color was better. She could sit up longer. Her voice got steadier. The doctors were careful not to make promises, but I could see they were excited about something. They used words like cautiously optimistic and encouraging progress. 3 weeks into the treatment, Lisa finally called me. She was crying before she even said hello. She apologized for disappearing, for leaving town right when I needed support. She admitted that Isabel asked her to leave because she knew Lisa couldn't keep the secret if she saw me grieving. Lisa said she'd been a complete mess with guilt, calling my sister every day to check on me. The oncologist pulled me aside after one of my visits. We stood in the hallway outside Isabel's room, and he told me her response was exceeding all their projections. They were seeing cellular regeneration they'd never achieved before in any other patient. He was careful to say it was still early, that they needed more time to be sure, but his hands were shaking slightly when he showed me the scan results on his tablet. I stopped by the house before my next visit and grabbed the box of rainbow wigs from Isabel's closet. The pink one with purple streaks was on top, the one she wore to her last chemo session when she did a dance in the parking lot. I packed all 6 wigs in a bag and drove back to the facility. Violet met me at the entrance and smiled when she saw what I was carrying. She said Isabel would love it, that she'd been asking about her wigs since the 2nd day of treatment. I went through the cleaning process and stood at the glass with the bag. Isabel's face lit up when she saw what I'd brought. She pressed against the glass, pointing at the pink wig, so I held it up and she nodded hard. The nurse brought it into her room after running it through some kind of cleaning machine. Isabel put it on right there and struck a pose like she was on a fashion show runway. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. She wore a different wig for each visit after that. The blue one with silver tips, the green one that looked like grass, the orange one she called her traffic cone special. She'd model each one through the glass, making jokes about her isolation fashion show, asking which one I liked best. We spent hours just talking through the intercom, her in whatever wig she'd picked, me with my hand on the glass. We were finding our way back to each other despite the barrier. She told me about the treatment, how it felt like her cells were rebuilding themselves from scratch. I told her about the phone calls I'd made, how confused everyone was, how her parents wanted to visit but the facility wouldn't allow it yet. 3 weeks became 4 weeks. The doctors started talking about her immune system getting stronger, about moving to the next phase. On day 28, Violet came to get me with a different look on her face. She said Isabel's numbers were good enough that I could go in the room with her. I had to wear special clothes and a mask, but I could actually touch her. The nurse opened the door and I stepped inside for the first time. Isabel was sitting up in bed wearing the rainbow wig with all the colors mixed together. I crossed the room and she stood up, a little shaky, and I wrapped my arms around her. I held her for 20 minutes straight. Her heart was beating against my chest. Her breath was warm on my neck. She was alive and real and here in my arms. She kept saying my name over and over. I couldn't stop crying, just holding her and feeling her breathe. The doctors ran more tests the next week. I sat in the waiting area while they did scans and blood work. The oncologist came out after 2 hours and asked me to come into his office. He pulled up images on his computer screen showing Isabel's scans. He pointed at areas where the cancer had been and said he couldn't find any active cells. His voice was careful when he said it, adding that she'd need watching for years to be sure, that they couldn't promise anything yet. But the scans were clear. I asked if I could tell her, and he said she already knew, that they'd just finished talking to her. I went back to her room and found her crying. Not sad crying, the kind where you're scared to believe something good might be real. I sat on the edge of her bed and cried with her. We held hands and didn't say anything for a long time. 2 weeks later, Violet told me Isabel was cleared to leave. The treatment had worked better than anyone expected. I drove to the facility on a sunny afternoon with the windows down. Isabel came out wearing normal clothes for the first time in 6 weeks. No hospital gown, no special suit. She looked thin and tired, but she was smiling. She got in the car, and we just sat there for a minute, both of us staring at the building. Then I started driving. We pulled into our driveway 40 minutes later, and Isabel looked at the house through the windshield. Her eyes went to the kitchen window, and she saw her coffee mug still sitting on the counter, the one with her lipstick stain I never washed. She started crying again, and I did too. We sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside. The first week home was strange and perfect at the same time. We were relearning how to exist in the same space after everything. Isabel needed to rest a lot. She'd sit on the couch for an hour, then need to sleep for 2 hours. She couldn't eat much, her stomach still adjusting from the treatment. But she was here and fighting, and that was everything. We watched movies. We talked about nothing important. We held hands while she slept. I made soup she could barely eat. She wore her rainbow wigs around the house even though she didn't need to anymore. After a week, Isabel said she wanted to have a party. Not to explain things individually to everyone, but to tell the whole story at once. She called it her resurrection party. I thought she was joking, but she was serious. We invited everyone to our house the next Saturday. When people started arriving, I played the opening drums of that song. Some people looked confused. Others started laughing. Isabel came out of the bedroom wearing the rainbow wig with all the colors, and everyone went quiet. She stood in our living room and told them everything. About the trial, about the fake death, about choosing to let everyone grieve rather than watch her maybe die for real. She owned her decision completely and said sorry for the pain she'd caused. Most people understood once they heard her explain it. Her parents hugged her for 5 minutes straight. Her cousins were crying and laughing, but some friends struggled with it. Her co-worker from the library left after 20 minutes without saying goodbye. Her neighbor said she felt used, that grief isn't something you fake. Isabel didn't defend herself or make excuses. She just said she knew the cost of her choice and she'd do whatever it took to rebuild trust. 3 months passed. Isabel went back for scans every 2 weeks, and they kept coming back clear. Her oncologist told us he was writing up the trial results to publish. He asked if Isabel would agree to be a case study, to let other doctors learn from what happened to her. She said yes immediately. She wanted her experience to help other patients facing impossible choices. My sister and I slowly fixed our relationship. It took time for me to fully forgive her for lying, for watching me suffer at that funeral. We had lunch one day, and she admitted she almost told me a dozen times. She said keeping the secret was the hardest thing she'd ever done, that she'd wake up at night feeling sick about it. I told her I understood why she did it, even if I hated that she had to. Lisa moved back to town in November. She called Isabel first, and they talked for 3 hours. Then she called me and apologized again. Isabel invited her over one Friday night. Lisa brought wine and we all got drunk like old times. We laughed about the whole thing, about the funeral that wasn't a funeral, about me Rick-rolling everyone, about the rainbow wigs. Lisa said she'd been in therapy dealing with the guilt. Isabel told her to stop feeling guilty, that she'd asked her to leave because she knew Lisa couldn't keep secrets. We finished 2 bottles of wine and Lisa fell asleep on our couch. I woke up the next morning to find Isabel already dressed, sitting at our kitchen table with a notebook and her laptop open. She'd been researching something since 6 a.m., she said, about other patients who might need what she'd gone through. 2 weeks later, she started the support group at the local cancer center, meeting every Thursday evening in a conference room they let her use for free. The first night, only 3 people showed up, a woman in her 50s with stage 4 lung cancer, a man whose wife was considering an experimental trial, and a teenager whose mom had just been told there were no more treatment options. Isabel talked to them about her choice, about the fake funeral, about how she'd weighed dying slowly against a 1% chance. She didn't sugarcoat anything or make it sound noble. She told them about me standing at her casket thinking she was dead, about the guilt she still carried for putting people through that grief. The woman with lung cancer cried and said nobody had been that honest with her about trials before, that every doctor made it sound either hopeless or like a miracle cure. Within 2 months, the group had 15 regular members, and Isabel was fielding calls from people 3 states away, asking about experimental options their oncologists hadn't mentioned. One Saturday afternoon, I found Isabel standing in our bathroom staring at the shower curtain, the clear one we'd compromised on 20 years ago. She looked at me and held out her hand without saying anything. I took it and pulled her close, and we started swaying in that tiny bathroom with no music playing. She hummed off key against my chest, the same tuneless melody from 2 decades earlier, and I felt her shoulders shake with silent laughter. She whispered that we were still idiots, and I agreed, perfect idiots who got a second chance at being idiots together. We danced for maybe 10 minutes, long enough that my back started aching, but neither of us wanted to stop. When we finally did, Isabel kissed me and said she'd been thinking about that moment every day during treatment, wondering if we'd ever get to be stupid together again. 6 months after she left the facility, Isabel's oncologist called us into his office for her latest scan results. He had this weird smile on his face when we walked in, the kind doctors don't usually wear when delivering cancer news. He pulled up the scans on his computer screen and pointed at areas that used to show tumors, except now they showed nothing. Remission, he said. Official remission, with no detectable cancer cells anywhere in her body. Isabel grabbed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers. We sat in his office for another hour going over monitoring schedules and future scans, but I barely heard any of it because I kept looking at Isabel and seeing her actually here, actually staying. That night we booked flights to a beach resort we'd been talking about visiting since our 20th anniversary, but never made time for. 2 weeks later, we were sitting on sand doing absolutely nothing, just existing in the same space, watching waves and reading books, and not talking about cancer or trials or death. Isabel wore a different rainbow wig every day, even though she didn't need to anymore, and other tourists would stare, but she didn't care. On the last day, she took off the wig and let the sun hit her growing hair, and she said this was the first time in 3 years she'd felt like a person instead of a patient. The coffee mug sat on our counter for 8 months after I brought Isabel home. Every time I walked past it, I'd see that lipstick stain and remember thinking I'd never see her wear that shade again. One morning, I finally picked it up and carried it to the sink, turned on the hot water and scrubbed until the stain disappeared. Isabel walked into the kitchen and saw me drying it, and she started laughing about my sentimental attachment to dirty dishes. I told her it felt like erasing the last piece of her being gone, and she said good. She wanted me to erase all of it. We were finding our way into a new version of normal where neither of us assumed we had tomorrow guaranteed. She'd stop in the middle of making dinner just to hug me. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. and check that she was still breathing. We started saying I love you about 40 times a day because we could, because she was here to hear it. The small stuff stopped feeling small anymore. Grocery shopping together or watching TV on the couch or arguing about what to have for breakfast. All of it felt like gifts we'd almost lost. The research facility published their trial results in a major medical journal that fall. Isabel's oncologist called to tell us that based on her success, the review board had approved 3 other terminal patients for the same protocol. Within a month, Isabel started getting letters forwarded through the facility from families of those patients, people thanking her for being brave enough to try something insane, for giving their loved ones a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. She kept every letter in a box in our closet and would read them when she had bad days, when the guilt about the fake funeral got too heavy. One letter came from a mother whose daughter was starting the trial, and she wrote that knowing someone had survived it made the terror slightly more bearable. Isabel cried reading that one, then called the facility asking if she could talk to families going through it, if she could help them understand what their loved ones were experiencing. They set up a volunteer program where she'd video chat with families once their patient entered the isolation phase, and she'd tell them the truth about how hard it was, how uncertain, how worth it. We renewed our vows on our 39th anniversary in our backyard with just 30 people there. Isabel wore the rainbow wig with every color, the one she'd worn to her resurrection party, and I wore the same suit from our original wedding that barely fit anymore. My sister officiated because she'd gotten ordained online specifically for this, and she cried through the whole ceremony. When it came time for rings, Isabel pulled out the ones we'd worn for 38 years and said these were the only ones she wanted, the ones that had been through everything with us. At the reception, someone asked what song we wanted for our first dance, and I pulled out my phone, queued up that song, and suddenly the opening drums filled our backyard. Everyone started laughing and singing, all of us off-key, and Isabel and I danced to the whole thing while our friends and family Rick rolled themselves at our vow renewal. Her parents were singing louder than anyone, and even Lisa was there crying and laughing at the same time. When the song ended, Isabel kissed me and said, "We were never going to live this down," and I said, "Good. I never wanted to." A year after the funeral that wasn't a funeral, we were both doing better than we'd dared to hope. Isabel's quarterly scans kept coming back clear. Her energy was almost back to normal, and she'd stopped having nightmares about the treatment. We'd rebuilt trust with most of the people we'd hurt, though a few friends still kept their distance, and we accepted that. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. We'd learned to live with uncertainty hanging over us, knowing that remission isn't the same as cured, that we were making plans without guarantees. We made new pacts to replace the old ones, promises about honesty and communication, and not making huge decisions alone anymore. Isabel promised to tell me if she ever got scared about the cancer coming back instead of trying to protect me from it. I promised to trust her judgment about her own body and treatment, to support her choices even when they terrified me. We promised to keep dancing in the bathroom with no music, to keep being idiots together for however long we got. We were sitting on our porch one evening in late summer, watching the sun drop below the trees, when Isabel said she'd make the same choice again. She said the chance to live, to have this time with me, was worth the cost of putting me through that temporary grief. I told her I understood now, that love sometimes means making impossible choices that hurt in the moment, but save something bigger. We sat there holding hands as the sky turned orange and pink, not talking about the future or the past, just being grateful for right now. A neighbor walked by walking their dog and waved at us, completely normal, like we were just another couple growing old together. And maybe we were. Maybe that's all we'd ever been, two people trying their best to hold on to each other through whatever came next. The sun finished setting and the porch light clicked on automatically, and neither of us moved to go inside because this moment felt too good to end.